It is the biggest risk factor for every chronic disease and death. If everyone in the world were to just be 7 years younger biologically than they are with this chronological type testing, then what we could do is reverse disease by 50% overnight. So just 7 years can make a massive population level impact that is felt by almost everybody.
Hello and welcome back to the 100th episode of the Thrive State podcast, and also the last episode of the 2022 year. So I want it to be super special for you. I want to give you something that is going to be game-changing in the way we look at health, in the way we look at longevity into the near future. And it's really around this concept of epigenetics. Well, what is epigenetics? Well, genetics, our DNA, is actually something we get from mom and dad. We get one strand from mom, one strand from dad, and we basically have 23 pairs of chromosomes in our body. Again, half from mom, half from dad. They contain basically every single play in the playbook to make a human body function. Now, here's the thing. That's just genetics. In a football game, you're not going to be executing or doing all the plays at the right time. You have to execute the right play at the right time to win the game. So how does the DNA determine which genes to turn on, which genes to turn off? Well, the concept of epigenetics tells us this, that it is the environment around our cells that basically communicate with the DNA that actually programs which genes to be turned on, which genes to be turned off. That ultimately can give us chronic symptoms and chronic disease, or it can give us optimal health, longevity, and peak performance. My book, Thrive State, is all about the choices that we make create this energetic or epigenetic environment around our cells that basically gives our cells the information to either thrive or just survive. Now, until recently, there's actually been very little diagnostic tools to be able to look at somebody's epigenome or the physical factors that are on top of the DNA that actually tell our DNA how to respond. Until now, there's been actually a series of different type of tests out there. It's called epigenetic tests. And what epigenetic tests do is they test these groups that are on top of the DNA, a lot of them being methyl groups. And depending on the messaging you're giving to your cells, different methyl groups will be deposited in different areas of your DNA. We're learning now that it is this methylation test that is a better predictor of longevity than any other lab that's out there. It's actually a better predictor of lifespan than your actual chronological age. So biological testing now is actually one of the things that epigenetic tests can actually tell us. So it's a really exciting field. And if you could know your epigenome, you could say, oh, wow, if I did sleep better, if I moved better, if I had more purpose, how's my DNA responding? This test can give us that information. Now, before we dive into my guest today, I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. If this podcast has given you value, if you've taken your life to the next level by listening and applying this podcast, please do us a favor. Leave us a 5-star review wherever you're listening to this podcast, and please engage with it. Subscribe, like, and leave some comments down. It really helps the show grow. So I appreciate you if you do that. And if you haven't already, pick up a copy of my book, Thrive State, at thrivestatebook.com. It is all about epigenetics. It's all about empowering you, that the choices that you make, how you show up in the world, creates an energetic state in your body that then speaks to your DNA. And guess what? Now we actually have a test to determine how you live your life and what it's actually telling your DNA. So stay tuned. My next guest is actually the founder of TruDiagnostic. He's a pioneer in the longevity space. He actually first founded one of the biggest compounding pharmacies, tailor-made compounding in the longevity space. Tailor-made compounding is actually one of the pharmacies I've ordered my peptides from through the past. Now, what my guest found was many of the doctors that was using tailor-made compounding lacked the tools to actually see how the patient was doing. This is why my guest founded TruDiagnostic. TruDiagnostics is actually a CLIA certified lab and health data company, which specializes in the understanding and reporting insights found through epigenetic methylation data. Since starting the lab in 2020, TruDiagnostic has created the largest private epigenetic database in the world with over 15,000 patients tested on their arrays. In this podcast, you're going to learn more about this epigenetic test. What information can it tell us now? What information can it possibly tell us in the future? I believe that this one test is going to be a game-changing technology that will tell us how we live our life and what it's actually doing to our biology. So, ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy this conversation I have with my good friend and founder of TruDiagnostic, Ryan Smith. Ryan Smith, my brother, welcome to the Thrive State podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
I love hanging out with you, whether it be at A4M conferences or other longevity conferences. You've always been a wealth of knowledge and information. But let's have a little fun right now. We start off the show with something called the 5 to Thrive, and it's basically 5 personal questions I get to ask you, all worth 1,000 points. And if you win, basically you win a very clean and healthy meal on me. All right, so people want to get to know a little bit more about Ryan Smith. So are you ready to play the 5 to Thrive?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, question number 1. If I were to force you up on a karaoke stage and give you the mic, what song would you go to?
Oh, that's tough because I am not a singer whatsoever. So I think it would have to be maybe something that would be rapped instead. Probably best for the crowd and for me.
Okay. give me a song.
One song I know every word to is actually like most Nicki Minaj songs. So I would probably say, anything Nicki would be great.
All right, Nicki Minaj. I would not have guessed that. Question number 2 is, as a child, did you ever dream about being a superhero? And if so, which one?
Oh, certainly. And probably Superman more than any other. Besides him being probably the most powerful, also generally good guy.
All right, sounds great. Question number 3. We know you're deep in the science longevity space, have worked with compounding pharmacies, now with TruDiagnostic. What one mentor or what one event made you really go all in to this new science of longevity in medicine?
Yeah, I think that's tough. Whenever I was prior to finding tailor-made compounding, I was actually in medical school and absolutely hated it. Going into my 3rd year, doing most of those clinical rounds, I couldn't imagine doing it anymore. And so I think that really the first time my eyes were significantly open to the type of medicine that was available was my first A4M conference, quite frankly. I think that it was the first time I ever experienced this world of functional, sort of integrative, alternative medicine where people were being preventative about their own healthcare, and leading patients to be healthy rather than trying to treat disease which already occurred. And that was I would say a good experience. And the many conferences and many physicians I spoke to afterwards just continue to build that idea.
Oh, sounds great. So far, 3,000 points. For an extra 1,000 points, you are stuck on a desert island and in comes a lamp, a magic lamp in which you only get one wish. What would that wish be, sir?
That's tough too. I think that generally probably just to have some resources on the island. I'd be pretty content to stay there.
All right, sounds good. Resources. Question number 5. For all the points, for all the marbles, how would you like to be remembered?
I think that first and foremost, definitively, kind and caring. I think hopefully as the main leader, but I also think that I'd like to contribute something into the field of science where knowledge has been created where it hadn't been known before.
Oh, wow. And the epigenetics and the epigenetic testing that TruDiagnostic is all about is something I'm super excited to share within my men's community here, but also in the Thrive State podcast to the people out there in the world. So I went to medical school as well. I probably should have left when you left, but I went much further into my career with that. So let me ask you, What was it like as somebody in their mid-20s starting this compounding pharmacy? How did you come up with the concept of the pharmacy and to start working on peptides?
Yeah, it was pretty overwhelming. I probably made the very stupid financial decision to leave med school in the first place. So, it was under a lot of pressure and scrutiny. But my background as an undergrad student had been a lot in peptide and protein biosynthesis, where I was doing a lot of recombinant chemistry to, express different proteins in bacteria and then purify it and do studies on those proteins like X-ray crystallography, et cetera. And so I had a background in peptides and proteins in particular as drugs and medicine. And also as someone who was sort of a college athlete, always had an interest in sort of performance, also knew how some of those products could be used to, sort of alter desired health outcomes or performance outcomes. And so, as much as I would like to take full credit for it, some of the peptide work had been really pioneered mainly in Australia, where they were doing a lot of growth hormone secretagogues. And we had a sort of a friend and business partner who was doing a lot there that was sort of opening us up to some of these ideas. And what we were able to do at TaylorMade Compounding was to really expand that idea and bring a lot more products to market. But the early days were very, very difficult. I didn't have a pharmacy background, and it was sort of thrown in there and saying, go at it. And, the space of pharmacy is one that is very well controlled and for good reason. And so learning a lot of lessons on what kind of sterile structures need to be built, what compounding procedures need to be followed was completely new. And so dealing with sort of all those logistical concerns and considerations was one thing, but we never had any problems with the market. I think that from a physician perspective, the ability for these peptides to address certain conditions was always really, really exciting. And we had massive response from day one. And so keeping up with the scale and keeping up with everything and trying to educate and inform as much as possible were some of the biggest things we dealt with.
Wow. I mean, truly an entrepreneur, truly hustled, truly brought something great into the world. Now, I only want to spend 2 minutes on this. And I know that we could probably spend the entire podcast on this, but we won't. But I just want your 2-minute version about what do you think is the future of peptides? We know there's a lot of regulatory things happening in the space. Some states aren't letting them in. Some people are getting them off market and things like that. In a minute or two, can you give me a general sense of what the regulatory landscape and legal, and this is just an opinion, no one's going to hold you to it. What do you think is going to happen to peptides?
Yeah, certainly. And unfortunately, we had to learn this the hard way, I think, of where things are going. At the height of our success at TaylorMade, we were doing, more business than just about any pharmacy in the United States. We were doing over, 90 million in revenue. It was a really good time, but unfortunately, we got lost over 75% of that overnight. And that was due to an FDA inspection, which sort of changed the rules of compounding, where they sort of are now sort of acting on guidance, which says that any product, whether it's a peptide or not, any product which is not FDA approved should not be compounded for sort of any type of physician use. So unfortunately, that takes away a lot of the really innovative things that we were doing. A lot of the products we started doing, like PT141, for instance, were not approved when we were starting them, but then got approved throughout the entire process. And so, unfortunately, I would say that peptides, as they're currently being done in the functional community through compounding pharmacies, I don't see a lot of longevity for. No pun intended with the rest of our conversation, but I think that, I think that as much as I'm a believer in the products, as much as I'm a believer in peptides as a class of drug molecule, I unfortunately think they're going to become more and more restricted. And so I think that you can still find them great. I hope that you can use them for your patients or yourself. But I think that unfortunately they're going to become fewer and fewer and fewer.
Well, a good thing you've took a little bit of a pivot, but what an important pivot as well is going into the diagnostic space. I know you found a TruDiagnostic because you really found a lack of diagnostic testing that we could do real time to be able to see, are the things we're taking and the way we live our life actually changing biology? So tell us about that and how you started getting into this space.
Yeah, certainly, and I think that you set it up well. I think that we always knew that the FDA could come in and be the biggest weakness of the business, and due to the lack of, I would say, long-term data, a lot of these new and innovative products, and so we're always looking for ways to generate that data in relatively quick and robust fashions, and it just so happened to coincide with the I would say advent of popularity and publication of some of these epigenetic clocks which existed. And these clocks, which I think we can get into, are really highly correlated to most healthcare outcomes. And so the idea is that if you can, change the biggest predictor of negative healthcare outcomes, you might be able to then prove that these things are having a positive effect, even over a short period of time. And so that was sort of the idea. But once I got into this, I would say, field of methylation-based diagnostics, I saw the potential way beyond these aging clocks. I saw the ability to read these different data sets in a variety of ways for a variety of health concerns. The way that I think I started viewing it was, how do we use these things to validate peptides? And whenever I started looking into it, I started to think of, how this DNA methylation markers could become essentially as important as genetic testing, but something that could be mitigated and changed, and therefore measured continually to improve outcomes. And so it became, for me, a complete philosophy shift onto new biomarker development.
That is really fascinating. So we're going to take a step back. We've been using a lot of big words, epigenetics and things like that, methylation and things like that. So we bring it back a little bit just on talking about epigenetics, and we'll talk about the methylation. But people are basically born with a fixed pair of genes, right? We get one set from mom, one set from dad, but everybody who's listened to this podcast has started to understand the role of epigenetics. It means that who we are as a person, our cellular phenotype, our longevity, our performance, and all those physical and phenotypic traits of us aren't determined just by the genes themselves. In fact, they probably, have a very small percentage, but really it's actually how these genes are expressed. The DNA is kind of like the entire play of a football playbook, but you're not going to play them all at once. You have to strategically play each individual play. And it's basically the epigenetics that basically determine how these genes get turned on, how these genes get turned off, right? So that's the whole field of epigenetics. So let me ask you a little bit about methylation then. There are different ways that the environment and how we live our life impacts our genes. One of them is methylation. Can you just explain that process briefly for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes off that similar terminology of on or off switches. Essentially, DNA methylation is that off switch. It's a way that our genes are sort of down regulated. And it really, the way that happens is a very physical process. It's essentially, using a football analogy, like a blocker. It's just sort of separating the things that would transcribe your DNA to mRNA, prevents them from attaching and then therefore doing their job. And so as a result, you make less of that RNA that includes less of that protein. And so it's how our DNA turns that off switch. And epigenetics itself stands for above the genome. So these are things that are happening above that sequence to regulate expression. And DNA methylation is probably one of the most robust. Again, I think you mentioned every single cell has a different epigenetic expression, which can make things complicated, but each cell also has 28 to 29 million of these different locations that become methylated. And so by looking at these patterns on what's turned on and turned off, we can get an idea of how your body wants to function and also how it currently is functioning in a variety of ways.
Oh, that's amazing. So I'm going to go just a little bit off course because we know that there's probably other ways that the DNA gets altered in their expression as well. We've got acetylation, and there's also things like, DNA is bound to like these large protein molecules called histones and things like that. Do we have any scientific data at this point to look at acetylation and histone modification as it, pertains to genetic expression?
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, though, the techniques we have to measure those different proteins in the configuration aren't nearly as robust or accurate right now as the idea of DNA methylation quantification. modification. And so that's why the majority of research into epigenetics really has been about methylation. But with that being said, this idea of these histone modifications are sort of the opposite, where basically acetylation is almost like taking two oppositely charged magnets and trying to push them together. You get that sort of force that repels them apart. And that's exactly what happens on the proteins, is you have those positively charged, which opens them up and allows all of that transcription machinery in to do its job and express those genes. And so although they're both epigenetic mechanisms, the one that's much more robustly available is DNA methylation.
Okay, so I'm just going to summarize that. We basically have genes in our DNA based on how we live our life, and the things that we take, our nutrients. It affects the cellular environment, which can then start to actually put marks in our DNA, these methylation tags that basically silences some genes. Now, so that's basically that in a nutshell. So how does the methylation pertain to aging, or at least our biological age? And we talk a little bit about those biological clocks.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that if there's one big takeaway, it's that DNA methylation can do a lot diagnostically. But where it got its start was definitively with these biological age tests. And it really started in I would say, right around 2013 with Steve Horvath from UCLA, who created sort of the first epigenetic clock as we know it. And basically it was reading these methylation patterns and trying to get them to predict via sort of an algorithm, a mathematical algorithm, someone's chronological age. And at first, this wasn't, I would say, envisioned to be used in a health context. It was really used at first for things like forensics, to date how old someone would be if they left DNA at a crime scene. Or it was immediately used in Europe to date Syrian refugees to see if they were under 18 or above 18, and then therefore, maybe eligible for asylum in that country. And so it really was, I would say, a little bit of a parlor trick more than a health diagnostic. But with that being said, it quickly changed. And the way that it changed is that they saw that those people who were younger with this testing than their biological age were really protected against negative health outcomes. And then vice versa, those people who were older with this type of testing tended to develop negative health outcomes a lot more frequently and a lot earlier. And so this idea of quantifying the body's aging process in relationship to chronological age was really investigated. And this wasn't the first time that these idea of biological age clocks had existed. It was just really the first time it had become so accurate and so predictive. And that's why it was such a big development in the space.
And what we're saying now is, the biological age that we're getting from these methylation tests more accurately predicts longevity, aging, or disease more than somebody's chronological age. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's always been the issue. These biological age clocks have existed in a variety of ways for a long time. Even in the 1920s, they were your biological age was the number of pack years you smoked per day plus your chronological age. So really crude measurements. But now we're actually measuring a marker in the blood that can give us more information about what will happen to you via this process. And I don't want to skirt over just the importance of aging. I know that probably a lot of people who listen to you probably already know it, but it is the biggest risk factor for every chronic disease and death. If everyone in the world were to just be 7 years younger biologically than they are with this chronological type testing, then what we could do is reverse disease by 50% overnight. So just 7 years can make a massive population level impact that is felt by almost everybody.
This episode of the Thrive State podcast is brought to you by the Thrive State Accelerator. The Thrive State Accelerator is actually a home course that I developed using the exact same techniques I work with my celebrity clients, CEOs, and executives on how to get them to the Thrive State. The Thrive State Accelerator teaches you how to master your 7 bioenergetic elements. That's sleep, nutrition, movement, stress and emotional mastery, relationships, our thoughts and mindset, as well as purpose. In this Thrive State Accelerator, you're also going to get a bonus module on optimization. That's how I talk about supplementation, peptides, all the optimization techniques I use with my clients to get them to the Thrive State. Now, for some of you who are just joining us for the first time, you guys might be wondering, what is the Thrive State? Well, the Thrive State is actually the energy, the epigenetic environment we give to our cells, telling our DNA how to act and how to respond. And if we want optimal health, longevity, and peak performance, if we can master these 7 bioenergetic elements, our ability to have those 3 things that we just said, optimal health, longevity, and peak performance, is at its greatest. And it also prevents you from getting chronic symptoms like brain fog, being overweight, feeling sluggish, acne, pain, all these chronic symptoms, as well as preventing you from getting chronic disease. So getting to that thrive state is really getting to that state to master being that very best version of yourself so you could show up for you, for your family, for your business, everything that's important to you. So go ahead, check it out right now at kienfood.com/accelerator and use coupon code podcast25 for 25% off. Now back to the podcast.
So moving beyond just aging now, I mean, the genes affect basically the entire codome of our body, which basically tells us our bodies how to function. So this methylation testing on our DNA can really tell us a little bit about how our body is experiencing things in every single system in our entire body. Yes?
Yeah, certainly. And as I mentioned, these clocks really started with aging and are continuing to be developed and improved in this area to make sure we know what is anti-aging. But beyond that, these mathematical algorithms of prediction are being used for just about everything you can imagine. One really good example is something that's already commercially available. Probably a lot of the physicians or patients listening have heard of it. Are these liquid biopsy tests for cancer, where they can diagnose cancer, even at stage 0 before it's detectable via any other method, just by finding DNA within the blood and the methylation patterns within that DNA. And so these things are starting to shift the way we practice medicine in every category of medicine, whether it's cardiovascular, medicine, whether it's, oncology, whether it's, sort of diabetes management. These algorithms have a lot of things to offer. Even right now, we can do a relatively sci-fi things like tell you how much pollution you've been exposed to, how much you've smoked across an entire lifetime. We can tell you how much you're currently drinking. We can tell you, generally predict things like your IQ or your mental processing speeds, all with a single drop of blood and the DNA within it. Some people anticipate that the amount of information we have might be more valuable than the information Google and Facebook has on us, because it includes all of the things that we do on a daily basis. We're very far away from that, but I think it's a good sort of thought experiment to show you exactly how much of our information about our daily lives are encoded into the expression of our genes.
This brings up a truly, truly amazing thing, because we talk about inherited traits from people, and some people say, "Oh, wow, we can't, we don't inherit that kind of protein." But there's certain things that culturally get imprinted. There are some generational traumas that get passed on, and I truly believe that epigenetics is basically it's what's getting passed on. And people don't know this one experiment of monkeys being exposed to the smell of cherries. This is actually called epigenetic transference. So I'm just going to briefly tell people about it. They took a bunch of male mice and they exposed them to the smell of cherries. And every time they exposed them to the smell of cherries, they would shock these mice. And the mice would basically, eventually learn to quiver every time they got shocked, to the point where they exposed the smell of cherries to those mice without the shock, but they would still quiver. That's when they knew those mice were primed. Get this, 2 generations after the mice that got shocked. So the male mouse that got shocked, not that generation down, but another generation down that never got exposed to the shock. Guess what? When they exposed them to the smell of cherries, those mice would start quivering. That just goes to show the power of basically a traumatic event changing the environment of our cells, and basically to protect a generation, those things get passed down.
That's awesome. And I've never actually heard that. So that's my first experience with that particular study. But I would say that even in what we see, we can see this all the time. We can see people who have been descendants of the Rwandan genocide, for instance, or the Holocaust based on some of their DNA expression markers. And so it's certainly exciting. And actually, that's one of our biggest sub focuses outside of aging is sort of this what we call this imprinting control regions. And so it's a huge area of focus for us, as it leads to a lot of neurodevelopmental related things like autism and Alzheimer's, for instance. And so definitely something that is up our alley, but I'm glad to have known about that study.
Oh no, it's a super interesting study, and I talk about it a lot just to talk about how certain things get passed on. But I would also love to believe, and now when we're starting to have the science to be able to back this up, that within our conscious control, we could slowly start to break free some of that imprinting. So I'm going to ask you now. I mean, we certainly have, methylation markers get tagged on us. With a shift in our lifestyle and our improvement in things, are you noticing that, things could be demethylated and get fixed, or does the silencing only happen like one time and it's irreversible?
Yeah, no. So I would say that it depends on where you're methylating in the genome. Some locations in the genome have evolved to be a little bit more stable than others, for instance, in terms of expression. But in terms of aging, the answer is definitively yes. We are seeing things that can improve aging rates, and then would therefore hopefully improve all those possibly negative outcomes. And so, from an aging perspective, yes, we're seeing definitively a lot of change. Unfortunately, for the imprintome, that we're looking at in these imprintome control regions, we're seeing that those are very, very stable. Generally, they don't change beyond throughout tissues, and they don't even change throughout lifespans. And so, the unfortunate part there is they might be a little bit less modifiable, but also that's not necessarily a bad thing all the time. So, for instance, we oftentimes have trouble creating a lot of brain-based algorithm for prediction, things that estimate, IQ or Alzheimer's development or dementia. And a lot of that is because we don't have access to the cells in the brain, which have different methylation patterns than those in the blood. And in the case of things like the imprintome, it actually allows us to look into the brain for some of those patterns in peripheral blood. And so some things are modifiable, some things are not. But I think that for general health and in trying to prove outcomes, there is definitively a lot that is modifiable.
Oh, that's really good to hear. And the next question I want to break down into, in fact, I've already included epigenetic clocks in my talk already, but there are several regions of the DNA. When we look at telomeres, and there's this other region called the conserved transcriptional response to adversity, which is basically one of the cell danger responses in the body. And when I started to study these different genetic sequences, there were almost sort of like a Rosetta Stone as to how we should be living our life. Meaning, when I looked at those areas, in terms of telomeres as well as the CTRA, stress is the number one driver of the CTRA, which is basically the cell danger response that causes inflammation to go up, our immune system to go down, leading to chronic symptoms, chronic disease. Stress is also a driver of telomere shortening, and we know that telomere shortening is actually a marker for early aging and disease as well. But choices that we make in our diet, our sleep, our movement, our social communities, our sense of purpose, our thoughts and our emotions, all those things actually are protected, And when I looked at that, it was almost kind of like our DNA telling us, this is what you need to be a human being alive today. And I'm wondering if the epigenetic clocks are going to be able to show us these things too, like maybe use those lifestyle factors to see how they affect epigenetic modification.
Yeah, certainly. And I think I might have avoided one of your questions about what's the best thing I've done for my health or my best health tool. And I always say this because it was the biggest surprise to me. But through doing this epigenetic testing, especially on myself, I found that I was never a big fan of meditation previously. I always just think, am I doing it right? Is this really meditation? Those types of things. But stress maintenance and stress reduction, especially through meditation, has had one of the biggest changes in my own biological age of anything that we've looked at. And this is backed up in several other studies that look, things like perceived stress or even things like PTSD as major drivers of that aging process. Yeah. So I think that, the two are inextricably linked, and the mechanism for that, we could even, now there are studies on things like working over 40 hours a week might, age you over 1.5 years by doing some of those behaviors. And so we are able to link them. Even now we can find things like fitness behaviors. We can actually predict your VO2 max. We can predict your grip strength and your walking speed, all from that same DNA methylation profiling that we would get to predict your biological age. And so we're starting to get, I would say, really, really high resolution here. There's some groups, not us, but there are other groups out there who are even being able to predict your relative level of diet quality through these epigenetic patterns. And so I think that very soon you absolutely will see this on the market to be a score of multiple areas of your own health and your own behavior. As I mentioned, we can already look at smoking and drinking. We can look at illicit drug use. We can, do a lot of these different things. But I think ultimately learning how to read those patterns to improve your own self-health will only continue to expand.
This is amazing, which is why I find this to be probably the hottest diagnostic tool that's going to be out there. And people, won't just be, doing these things like once a year or anything like that. This is something you could probably make a change or a modification in your lifestyle or the things that you're taking and see some pretty relatively quick results on an epigenetic test. Yes.
Yeah, I like to use smoking as a good example because we can actually predict if you're a current, former, and ever smoker by looking at one location on your genome. And what happens is the moment you stop smoking, the methylation patterns on that tend to demethylate. So we lose those methylation on that location. And by judging how sort of the relative percentage of methylation at that one location, we can probably estimate when you stop smoking, for instance. And so, being able to read those patterns for a lot of sort of health related events, even in the short term, can be indicative of health behaviors.
You bring up a question that people ask me a lot. They ask me, oh, okay, well, is methylation then a bad thing? Because look, if smoking, is a bad thing and it causes this gene to silence and methylation gets on, is that always the case? And my answer to them is there are probably some good genes and probably some bad genes, but what's your answer to that?
Exactly the same as yours, I think. And I always bring up the examples of tumor suppressor genes and oncogenes, right? Tumor suppressor genes are meant to be activated to suppress cancer. So we might not want them methylated as much as some other genes. And oncogenes the opposite, right? Those genes that might proliferate growth, cause cancer. We probably wouldn't want them always turned on, right? And so the idea is that methylation in and of itself is not good or bad, but I think that a lot of this morphs out of this idea of the ability to methylate and methylation cofactors, things like 5-methylfolate and folic acid and other B vitamins, where people are given those to fix deficiencies in their ability to methylate. And so two separate processes. One, we're talking about the biochemical process of attaching methyl groups. The other one, we're talking about what your DNA is regulated with those methyl groups. And they are sometimes connected. But with that being said, we would consider them two completely separate processes, each, which would need their own clinical interpretation.
Got it. Now, I know a lot of people are going to be excited after this podcast gets out there. Right now, is this something that somebody can just, go to TruDiagnostic.com and order a test themselves, or do they need a doctor's prescription? And how do they even know how to interpret it? What's the process now?
Yeah, certainly. So you can order from us as a direct consumer at TruDiagnostic's website. However, the reporting that you get is generally a lot less elaborate and a lot less descriptive as what you would probably get through your physician. And that's really because on a direct consumer fashion, we're not allowed to report on disease. And a lot of these things are inextricably linked with disease and need to be really talked about under sort of the guidance of a physician. But if you're really looking to just quantify aging itself, even though I think everyone at TruDiagnostic would probably consider it a disease, is not defined as a disease by the FDA. So if you're just looking for, how old you are, what your pace of aging is, or what your telomere length is, you can definitely go as a direct consumer. But I think that most people would probably get more value from the interpretation and the additional metrics which are provided through a physician.
And now me asking for my physician friends who probably never heard of or some of them have never heard of epigenetic testing before. What resources do they have now? Yeah. Their patients are going to come down, knocking on the door, saying, "I heard the Thrive State podcast. I want this test," and he'll order it. But will he get a bunch of data that he might not be able to interpret? And how are you navigating that space right now?
Yeah, and this is probably the hardest thing that we deal with on a daily basis is the educational process. And so for any physicians who would like to learn more, we do offer a lot of education and training through us directly. Unfortunately, I think that from an educational perspective, we haven't seen, I would say, entire entities devoted to this and its clinical application yet, but we're starting to see this with events like the Anti-Aging Academy, where we're going to have 3 main stage talks in December. We've recently did a whole epigenetics course with the Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Institute and Dr. Jeffrey Bland. So we're starting to see it a little bit more often now that these tools are available and out there. But for anyone, you can always reach out to us directly and we can point you to those resources as well.
That sounds amazing. Wow. I think we really covered a whole bit here. I'm just going to allow 1 second to see if any gentleman that we currently have on the call right now has any questions before I ask my last question. Looks like I answered them all, but they put them in the chat below. So now, before we close with my last question, I want to ask you, how do people find out a little bit more about the next course or more about the lab itself? Where do they get those resources?
Certainly. So you can always come to TruDiagnostic, and we have sort of I would say, an asset archive that we've created with a lot of our educational lectures, as well as a lot of our sort of publications and papers. A lot of this information, as I mentioned, is still very, very new. Some of our best algorithms were still only created in late 2021. So these things are still very new, and the information is scattered all over, but we are definitely make it, I would say, our priority to help educate anyone who's interested in this. And you can always reach out to us. I would say beyond that, you can see a lot of really good aging content from a lot of other individuals as well, who are out there doing a lot of aging analysis and clocks. Altos Labs, probably one of the best funded startup of all time, by Jeff Bezos at 3.2. They're doing cellular reprogramming with things like Yamanaka factors to really reset these clocks. And so if you have not heard about it already, there are going to be plenty of opportunities to learn about it in the future. It is, if you can imagine the impact genetic testing has had, imagine a genetic test that you can change and then, retest and affect values. This is sort of what's going to happen with DNA methylation. So if you haven't heard about it, feel free to reach out to us at TruDiagnostic. We'll help you find some of those answers or the appropriate papers, and we'll try and go from there.
That's awesome. That's TruDiagnostic without the E, TruDiagnostic.com. Now, we did have a few last minute questions come in, so I'll just go ahead and let them ask it. Go ahead, David Stewart, you had a question.
Yeah, I know Steve Horvath, and I know Morgan Levine, and I think they're both over at Altos now. What's very interesting about what you're talking about is the specificity of this. And as a diagnostic tool, what are you basing? Is there like a lot of this stuff, genetic testing is based on these huge data sets. How are you getting your data set, and how are you sifting through that to say, this reading indicates this behavior change that you should do?
Yeah, certainly. So that's a good question. And currently, our private epigenetic database is the largest private epigenetic database in the world. We've now tested over 20,000 patients. And so our end to power these studies is getting very, very well powered. However, prior to that data set, we didn't have our own internal data set. And we really had to work with publicly available biobanks. And we're still doing that to a large degree, using things like Partners Biobank from Harvard, or the Health and Retirement Study, or some of the studies we've done in collaboration with Duke and Columbia, where we've done longitudinal testing and biobank samples from places in New Zealand. And so we've gotten these from a lot of different locations as we've continued to build our own data set. But our own data set continues to be limited, as we've only been going for right around 2 years now. And so we don't have a lot of those outcome data. So as we're training to those, we really have to do two things. One is we first have to train the data. And this is to use as much samples and as big of processing as we can, using computer learning and machine learning algorithms, to then try and predict a certain value. But that alone is not sufficient. We also then have to validate. And this is where, this is going to be the most important, because then we go to these biobanks, Frames and Heart study or the normative aging study, to see how well our algorithms actually perform. If we're trying to predict, for instance, negative events with aging, we would then look at how these aging rates reflect to hazard ratios of disease incidence, for instance. Or we'd look at how we can predict certain inflammatory markers and how close we were. So that's really how we judge it, is how predictive are our algorithms, judged by hazard ratios. And then in terms of precision, we always measure it by this thing called the intra-class correlation, which I only mention, I know it's complicated, but the reason I mention it is because it's been the biggest weakness of these epigenetic clocks to date. So anyone who's experimented with these epigenetic clocks before and said, I tested over the course of 6 months and had wildly different values. And that's been a problem. Even the original Horvath clock had up to 3.9 years of the mean absolute error, which means if you're testing within that time, how do you know if it's a real signal or if it's just noise of the measurement? And so thankfully, people like Morgan, before she left Yale for Altos, created things like these principal component analysis clocks to make these tools much better for clinical use. And we implement all of those at TruDiagnostic to make sure that things are really actionable, and we prove it in these validation studies. One of my biggest pet peeves about the industry are all these proprietary clocks where they just sort of say, trust us. And I think that we sort of liken it to fortune tellers, where you can believe what they say, but it's better to have some of the proof that they're correct. And so those validation studies are absolutely key, and something I would recommend anyone to ask for when they're doing this type of testing.
Great question. And you can see there's a lot that goes into this. And I'm really happy to be working with somebody who really wants to get the science right. And that's what you're going to get with TruDiagnostic. I'm going to end with the very last question I asked all my guests, Ryan. Of everything that you've seen, peptides, hormone optimization, biohacking tools, and everything like that in your own life, what has been your best medicine?
Oh, so I was sort of, alluding to, stress relief being the biggest mover of my biological age, but I continue to probably say that's probably true. Whenever you see something so objectively measured, clearly linked to behaviors that you didn't believe in before, I think it can definitely change, your opinion of some of those things, and it's definitely done that for me. And so I would say that honestly, mindfulness has been the number one intervention. And if you're like me and skeptical of that as an answer, I encourage you to try it and just see how it works.
That's amazing. Ryan Smith, founder of TruDiagnostics, thank you so much for your time and for being on the Thrive State podcast.
Yeah, thanks again for having me.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of the Thrive State podcast. And if this podcast is bringing a lot of value to you, if you find that your life is just improving with this podcast, that your life is getting to the next level, please consider supporting it. And here's a few ways you can do so. You can do so by liking this video and commenting on this video, and also sharing this video with your friends and family. Another thing you can do is go to ratethispodcast.com/ThriveState. Go ahead and leave us a 5-star review there. It will really, really help this show grow. And this will give me more time so that I could actually give more content to you, just like you got in this episode. And if you haven't already picked up a copy of my book, Thrive State, Your Blueprint for Optimal Health, Longevity, and Peak Performance, you can pick it up now. It became a #1 new release in longevity. Go to thrivestatebook.com. And if you enjoy the book, please consider leaving us a review as well. And the last thing you can do, if you're liking everything here and you want to work more closely with me as well as my team to get you into the Thrive State, go to kienvu.com/accelerator and consider joining the home course, the Thrive State Accelerator. It's really the course that I use. It's the concepts that I use personally when I work with CEOs, celebrities, and my high-profile clients to get them to the Thrive State. Again, the Thrive State Accelerator at kienvu.com/accelerator. And because you're a listener of this podcast, I want you to save 25% by using the coupon code podcast25. I hope we continue to give value to you. And remember always, you are your best medicine.